So next up we have a report on the police monitor's continuing research into evidence-based best practices regarding police oversight. And we have Farah Muscadine here. Thank you for coming again. And she has been doing an extensive survey of citizen oversight in the country and is here to report on it. Thank you for coming.
Good evening, members of the Public Safety Commission. My name is Farah Muscadine. I'm the interim police monitor. And on May 22nd, I did a presentation before City Council in the work session. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of my presentation before Council. The presentation will consist of just discussing the resolution, which is basically the impetus for the research, some overview of the preliminary research that I conducted, brief discussion on the oversight model, some preliminary observations, and then next steps and timeline. On March 22nd, Council passed a resolution directing the city manager to look into evidence-based practices on oversight. It also directed the city manager to consult with various stakeholders, the Public Safety Commission being one of them. And obviously other stakeholders, including the Police Department, the Human Rights Commission, and also interested stakeholders. As it relates to police oversight, NACOL, the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, is the premier expert on this topic, and I reached out to them pretty much immediately after this resolution was passed, and they've been extremely helpful to me in my research. And in many of their publications, they talk about cities and municipalities that are looking into oversight, that they should focus on best fit as opposed to best practice. You may also recall the 21st century policing recommendations that began under President Obama. And in there, in Pillar 2, they talked about policy and oversight. And again, they reiterate the point that every community should define the appropriate form and structure of civilian oversight to meet the needs of the community. At the time, Brian Buckner was the former president of NACOL, and when he testified before the task force, he said, "Citizen review is not an advocate for the community or for the police. This impartiality allows oversight to bring stakeholders together to work collaboratively and proactively to help make policing more effective and responsive to the community. Civilian oversight alone is not sufficient to gain legitimacy. Without it, however, it is difficult, if not impossible, for the police to maintain the public's trust." NACOL surveyed about 97 oversight agencies across the country, and in there they were able to find 5 common goals in oversight. It includes improving public trust, ensuring accessible complaint processes, promoting thorough and fair investigations, increasing transparency, and determining police misconduct. In my research, and as defined by NACOL, there are 3 oversight models. One is the investigative model. The majority of the agencies that I spoke to fall in this model where civilians investigate allegations of police misconduct. Then they have the review-focused model where civilians review the thoroughness of the internal affairs investigations. Then lastly, what we have the auditor-monitor model. They're lumped together by NACOL, but they're slightly different. The auditor model is that literally they audit the internal affairs investigations. We have the monitor model where we monitor the investigations from beginning to end. But then we also look at broad patterns of investigations, findings, and discipline. I did note a hybrid, which is basically a combination of all 3. So when I looked at various cities to reach out to learn more about their models, how they operate, how they became, how they were created, I wanted to look at what oversight model they fell into, the length of time they existed, the population of the city, the size of the police department, median income, and the legal authority, basically how were they created. So I spoke to 28 agency directors in my preliminary research. 14 fell under investigative, 7 under review-focused, 5 auditor-monitor, and 2 hybrid. I also spoke to the NACOL research fellow, 2 consultants, 2 board chairs, one for BART, which is the Bay Area Rapid Transit Authority, and the Dallas Independent Police Board chair. And then I also spoke to the liaisons to the Houston Independent Police Board and the San Antonio Chiefs Advisory Action Board. And also the NYPD Inspector General, Phil Ure, who was former president of NACOL, and also the former director of the Washington, D.C. Oversight Agency. And this is just a visual for you to see the cities that I talked to across the country. There are about 150 oversight agencies. I spoke to about 20% of them. And just so you could, just a visual to show the broad range of agencies that I spoke to. Just some preliminary observations quickly. Most of them, obviously, it's all different. The states all have different laws, and most of the states don't have what we have in terms of Local Code 143, the restrictions in 143. And so that obviously makes our oversight a little bit unique to other areas. Most, if not all, of the agencies that I spoke to were created by ordinance or charter. Seattle and Albuquerque, they negotiate segments in their collective bargaining, for example, length of the investigation and discipline. Denver, however, specifically delineates that oversight cannot be a part of their collective bargaining. And then here, obviously in the state of Texas, we know that charter and ordinance cannot supersede state law. The funding ranged across the board, but many of them were funded as a percentage of the police department, and those range from 0.5% to 1%. Most of the jurisdictions did not have what we call the 180-day rule, where discipline has to be imposed within 180 days. We were definitely in the minority of that group. And the majority of them had some sort of civilian board that ranged from 9 to 23 members, and many of them operated in panels. And the reason why they operated in panels, and this was a surprise fact that I learned from talking to the directors, is the time commitment. Most of these volunteer boards spend about 30 to 40 hours a month in their oversight capacities. So they changed it to operate in panels so there would be a rotation. So each panel would work on a different case rather than having the same amount of people because the time commitment was pretty significant. Discipline, most agency directors made recommendations as to discipline, but ultimately, I would probably say 99% of the time, the ultimate decision was left with the chief of police on discipline. And staffing ranged from 2 to 15, but I do want to point out an outlier. The city of Chicago, their civilian oversight for police accountability, they have 145 employees. So that's a little bit of an outlier, but the majority of them fall between 2 and 15. And the complaints range from 30 to 1,500 a year, and it really depended on the type of model. Some oversight agencies did not handle internal complaints and complaints that come through the police department at all. Some just handled external. So that's the difference where you see the range is so significant. So in terms of next steps, we're going to continue our research and analysis, hopefully drill down on some of the cities that we've already reviewed. And then we're going to strategically involve our stakeholders and our interested community organizations, and with that, with their assistance, we're hoping to narrow down the scope of, like the 28 cities that I've already talked to, narrow it down to a smaller number to do a deeper dive, and then potentially either do site visits or do a video conference to talk with the staff from those agencies that we want to do a deeper dive in. While that, we're going to do a community outreach plan and simultaneously legal review, because it's going to be important that we ascertain what we can do independent of the meet and confer agreement. And that will be done, obviously, by the city legal department. This is just a visual of comparing some of the things. I try to ask each agency director the same question. For example, do they take anonymous complaints? Do they have subpoena power? Do they have a civilian board? And so this is just a visual of, after I synthesize this information, putting it together in a way that will show a comparison with Austin. Oops, sorry, kind of skipped. And then our draft timeline. It is the goal that I'll come back this month in June at the end of the month to report back to council, hopefully narrowing down the list of cities that we're going to review in more detail, and also our site visit team. Then to hold those conferences or those visits in July, August, September, again simultaneously that legal review and community outreach, and then come back with a final recommendation in October. One thing that I do want to add specifically to this is that we've created a working group, Police Oversight Advisory Working Group, that will help me and this, obviously city management with coming up with a proposal of what we think our oversight should look like. And it's the goal to hopefully have that meeting this month and talk about the cities that we're going to review and the site visits. So I just want to leave you with this quote. Again, it just talks about how the differences between cities and counties in the U.S., it is likely there's no single model. Even when I spoke to agencies in the investigative model, they were significantly different. And so the best form of oversight for individual jurisdictions simply depends on the circumstances faced by that jurisdiction that is either creating or updating its oversight. This is a recurring theme that I found in my research that is really unique to the city, and that we really have to do what's best and that what makes sense for Austin. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you for your work. Yes, Chief Holt.
My apologies. Last month I was in training, so I missed something. Can somebody share with me what is evidence-based policing and how does that affect the relationship between the community and police? What is it?
So it's an interesting question. And so there isn't necessarily evidence-based practices in police oversight. I literally I've asked several entities. I asked NACOL, and again, it's the point about it's very unique. There might be some practices that you generally want in oversight. For example, NACOL recommends core elements of what oversight should contain, but in terms of the evidence-based part, that research, I believe, is still being conducted. I've been referred to a lot of professors and individuals across the country that are doing research to come up with that, but we don't currently have it right now.
Chief, can you answer for me?
I can try.
Can I,
So
just one second, Chief Newsom. So, Commissioners, you're getting passed out the council resolution that Ms. Muscadin referenced in her presentation, and on page 4 is the part directing her to do what she's doing right now, and right there you see in the first sentence Chief Holt's question about developing evidence-based best practices regarding police oversight. Okay, thank you, Chief.
So in regards to evidence-based policing, maybe not evidence-based police oversight, which would be two different topics, there is a movement, for lack of a better term, in the policing field that is akin to what medical science has done for years, and that is to attempt through data and experimentation to define what are evidence-based practices. So for instance, when we have a vehicle burglary problem in a certain neighborhood, you know, we attack it a certain way with directed patrols. We compare pre and post data. You know, we had so many vehicle burglaries this month. We put these extra cops working doing these things, and the next month we had a reduction. But how do you compare that in a scientific way to say if the intervention of those officers actually contributed to that reduction? And so that's an example of what evidence-based policing is trying to come up with. But the whole concept of it is in its infancy and kind of intangible as far as practices go.
And you need a data set, a large data set.
That's right.
To come to conclusions. And I think, you know, what we're learning from Ms. Muscadin's research is that there is no single way of doing this in the United States, and so it's very hard to compare apples to oranges to find out what works. Other questions? Yes.
Ms. Muscadin, could you give us a fairly brief, simple description of what in Chapter 143 limits the oversight that can be done by Austin?
So, for example, the 180-day rule is specifically delineated in Chapter 143, which means what it states is basically that discipline has to be imposed by the 180th day, and the chief is limited to, I believe, a written reprimand on discipline if the discipline is imposed after the 180 day. So most jurisdictions, and I see Chief Newsom nodding, described that right. Okay, thank you. Most jurisdictions that I've talked to across the country do not have that limitation.
And another issue, if I may, is that confidentiality of an officer's file and what they've been accused of that maybe hasn't been substantiated yet. It's an allegation, and that is not public record in Texas. And so, how do you get a citizen review panel like the one that I served on here in the city for 8 years before it went away in December. How do you give citizens access to what is confidential information?
Another example is the 143 specifically prohibits anonymous complaints. That's in there. And most, I would say most jurisdictions I've talked to across the country afford for it, or it was allowed for in the charter or in the ordinance.
Okay, so those type items, would they be allowed to be included in the meet and confer
They
agreement?
must be.
You
Yes.
You can negotiate those
Yes.
and
Yes.
not be in violation of
Yes.
Right.
the state.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's the only way, I think, to
Thank you.
get around some of those
Yeah.
issues, because, like Ms. Muscadin said in her presentation, you cannot you can't use an ordinance to supersede state law.
Right.
So I had a question. If you know, what percentage is your office's budget compared to the police department? Do you know those?
The average over the last 3 years is 0.3%.
0.3.
Mhm.
And
It
then
ranges from 0.29 to 0.31, but I averaged it.
And you said that typically it's between 1 and 3, or 0.5 to
0.5.
1. And then another question I had is, within the 3 models that you described, where would you place what we had before in Austin, the citizen review panel? How would you put that into these 3 models?
So I would put the CRP as the review focus. So to a certain extent, with the police monitor's office and the CRP, it's a bit of a hybrid because it encompasses both. But yeah, I would put that in the review focus because primarily what the CRP was doing was reviewing the thoroughness of the investigations and making recommendations as to discipline.
Other questions? Yes, Ms. McCurdy.
What was the thought process behind the 180-day rule?
That I don't know. I think that has been in state statute for a very, very long time. I really don't know the history of that. It's not something I think that's recent at all in Texas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Quick question. The restrictions of 143, does that make it very difficult in your mind to establish an investigative model, or are we in a review type model? I notice most of the Texas departments are because of 143.
I mean, I think that there's an argument for that, and I think that that's why the legal review is going to be really important, because, like, if I may be frank, I mean, the litigation that the city is in now, that the union filed, is a case of first impression in Texas, and so that is pretty much going to potentially determine the scope of oversight in terms of being outside of 143 or the limitations of the statute. It's probably going to have a lot of precedent with that particular lawsuit. So, I mean, is it the determinant factor? I don't know, but I think it is a significant factor in that. So, for example, San Antonio's Chiefs Action Advisory Board, that is contained in their collective bargaining agreement. Houston's, it is not, but they are about to initiate their negotiations, and they may choose to include it. Dallas, it is not, but Dallas is also outside of 143. And when I spoke to their chair, they are looking into expanding their oversight functions. But this particular litigation has the potential to impact, the whole state, or it will impact the whole state.
Okay, well, thank you, and